with them, and we've done a little research, and I'll talk about that. But I'm hoping that this presentation will give people some background information and some additional knowledge, so when they do, are they thinking about putting in boot brush stations, or they're thinking about kind of how to do that, this will help them out. So in terms of outline, you know, I'm going to start with some boot brush basics, specifically kind of what they are, and go over that, and then talk a little bit about what Play Clean Go has to offer if you're thinking about boot brushes as well. And then I'll get into the Southern Illinois project, things that we've done here specifically, and how we've addressed boot brushes and how we've used them to aid our efforts. And then I'll spend the most of the time, you know, towards the end, talking about a research that's been done on just how effective are these things. Do they do what we want them to do? So in general, a boot brush in most basic terms is an interpretive sign about invasive species and a brush together. These are often installed at trailheads, parking areas, or other high-use areas. And the idea is to give people an opportunity to use them to knock off seeds, clean their shoes, as well as learn a little bit more about invasive species. So they're designed, or they should be designed, to be relatively simple to use, something that's easy to do and doesn't take a long time. You don't want people to dwell on them. You want them to get the message across quickly, and then use them, and then go about their day recreating and enjoying the outside there. Just a side note, I took this picture for some boot brush signage we were doing, and I think I took it 8 or 9 years ago, and I realized I still have the same boots on today, so that's kind of funny. But there's a lot of different designs out there, but they all share some of the same things, and we'll talk about that in general. But this is a newly installed boot brush here. You can kind of see the way they look. And it should be pretty common. I think a lot of places are using these now. Boot brushes are becoming more and more commonplace throughout the nation. And I think at minimum, if you're going to put a boot brush in, I think at minimum what you're going to get is really directed educational signage about invasive species. The nice thing about them is that you can tailor the language and the education on there to directly target hikers and trail users, because that's who's going to see them. So even at a minimum level, you're going to get some educational efforts from these. And at best, you're going to use these boot brushes as a means of reducing the spread of invasive plants through removing seeds that are caught in the mud on boots and shoes of hikers. So at their best, it's really a spread prevention technique, and even at a minimum, it's an educational awareness raising thing. And these boot brushes really do give us, at their best, a management approach that really focuses kind of on that early level. And so a lot of our management with invasive species, and we've all seen this invasion curve, kind of starts somewhere in the middle as we're starting to become aware of the problem. The infestations increase in size, and we're dealing with them. Boot brush stations really do help us start to manage invasive species really at that early level through prevention, trying to prevent the introduction of new species and the spread of species. So it's often used as a companion to other management efforts. But again, hikers, this is kind of the use, the target audience for these boot brushes, whether it's kids, adults, or whatever. And I always have to sneak a few pictures of my kids in to presentations. But these are the people that we're trying to address by using boot brush stations. And we do want them to be used and then get that message across in a nice, succinct manner. And putting this presentation together, I was looking around and trying to see just how widespread they are. And one thing I like to do when I'm talking on a particular topic is to go to Google and see kind of what's up there. And if you do a search on boot brush invasive images, there's a ton of things out there. And so you can see there's a lot of people using boot brushes. If you look around online at cooperative weed management area websites or plant councils websites, you see a lot of states or provinces throughout North America using these as tools. And so I'm really excited to see that. It seems that they've taken off over the last 10 years or 15 years or so and become really popular as a tool that you can use and that is being used. Just some design tips based upon what we've seen and how we've used them, and we've installed them in a bunch of different ways. Overall, I think for long lasting, making sure you anchor your post in the ground with concrete is a very good thing to do, just to prevent them from getting loose or moving around. You'll find people are often sitting on top of them or leaning against them, and they're treated pretty roughly. So making sure they're pretty sturdy is a good thing. And then we found too that a really important part of a boot brush is this box around the base. And so we use treated lumber and make a 4 foot by 4 foot or 3 foot by 3 foot box around the base of the boot brushes, dig it down a little bit, and then lay the bottom with weed mat and cover it with gravel. I think that helps keep the boot brush a lot cleaner. It makes it look a lot neater. And then also with the weed mat and the gravel, it kind of helps prevent germination of seeds when they fall in there, so your boot brush doesn't get overgrown. We've done it both ways, with or without a base, but by far adding a base is the best thing to do. I think it really increases the aesthetics of your boot brush and then the usefulness. And then we've also found mounting your brushes 8 inches or so off the ground on your post is a good thing to do, just to keep them from getting in the dirt, keep them from getting covered over by mud as quickly. You don't want them so high that people have to kind of reach up there and to use them. So we found that 6 to 8 inches is really an ideal range to kind of mount those brushes off the ground for maximum utility. So this is just a shot of a pretty well designed, newly installed boot brush. You can see that box around it filled with fresh gravel. The brush is kind of a little bit off the ground there, and got good clearance and a nice signage. So this is what we're looking for. One thing we have found after we put these in is that they do need regular maintenance, in the sense that if you're interested in installing a boot brush, it's not a one-time effort. They do, with use, they do need to be cleaned. They do need to be replaced. The bristles do. And so it's something that you do need to kind of factor that into your decision of how many you want or where you want to place them, is to make sure that you have the ability to maintain them. What we found is that the bristles, they wear out pretty quickly, particularly in high use areas. And so really they need annual replacements, at least annual replacements. Some places I would even recommend twice a year for high use trails. For low use sites, you can probably get by every 2 to 3 years, but you probably want to look at them every year or so, at least drive by to clean them up, and then assess whether those bristles need replaced. Sometimes graffiti or vandalism may happen on them, people painting over the signs or scratching the signs or things like that. We found that a little plexiglass covering over the signage is really nice, because it's cheap and it's replaceable or cleanable, as well as you often get grime and things kind of getting on these over time, over use, and so they need to be washed anyway. So the ones with the plexiglass covering, it makes it a lot easier to deal with. And then also with these boxes with the gravel in there, they fill in with dirt as people walk on them, people use them. So we found that we have to replace the gravel every couple years. And with that, you can dig the old gravel out, and some people use a sieve or something to get rid of the dirt and put that gravel right back in, or just simply move it and put fresh gravel in. We've had some people use pre-emergent herbicides and spray the area there a couple times a year to kind of keep any germination down, or just to come in and spray it with a post-emergent herbicide just to kill any weeds that may be growing. That seems to work pretty well. The main thing is with your building your box, to get it a couple inches off the ground. We find that you tend to lose that box over time with leaves or dirt filling in, and you don't see it. So again, just regular maintenance, making sure these things are taken care of, and we'll talk about later of kind of why that's really important for users in general. But like I said, they do get worn down. Here's a shot of a boot brush, and you can see that on the left, it shows a picture of it being really overgrown. This is one where it did not get the regular maintenance it needed. The gravel filled in with dirt, and then the weeds came. So it's kind of covered over. On the picture of the right, it's a close-up of those bristles. They were well used and worn down, and they are no longer, serving the purpose that they were intended. They're not cleaning the bottom of that shoe as they should. They've just been worn down too much. A couple other shots. Over time, as people use these, you'll see a little mound of dirt building up underneath of the brush that's getting knocked off of the shoes. This can get built up pretty quick, particularly if you're on a dirt path or someplace where people get a lot of dirt and mud on their shoes as they're hiking, or a high use area, and they'll fill up so much so that the dirt just flops over top of the bristles. And so cleaning that out once or twice a year, just coming in and removing that dirt pile, is a really good thing to do to clean it out. You'll see this. When you are putting these together, we find that we really like these boot brushes that have the easily replaceable bristles. So this is the kind that we've used, and you can see there it's a one-piece unit, but the wooden mounts and the bristles are easily replaceable just with a couple screws. And so they cost, the replacement bristles, the ones that we bought, I think they cost between $5 to $7 for each set. And it takes about 15 minutes to replace. It's really simple, and it's a nice way to keep them up going. So if you do get boot brushes, I would highly recommend making sure that you have replaceable bristles in there and something you can easily change out. It really makes maintaining them a lot easier. In terms of your signage, Play Clean Go does have some things out there available. They have a website you can get to and see, and it have some information in there, some details about boot brushes on that, as well as some signage that's available. You can see different species here highlighted, and there's other options available, and there's just a close-up of one here you can see, and I really like this design that they've come up with for Play Clean Go. It gives you a message very quickly, very simply. There's two sentences right at the top of the sign that says what we want to do and why we want to do it. Some good graphics on here, and there's a space to put your own logos. So this is a really good example of signage and kind of what you're trying to do is get people to get the message across, use it, and then move on to enjoy their day. So one thing that's important to notice is that this works to prevent the spread of invasive species, but not all invasive species. It really boot brushes target invasive plants that have small hard seeds that are likely to be picked up in mud and dirt. So that's the ones that it's going to work against. Bird dispersed seeds or stick tight type seeds it's not gonna be as effective. It's really looking at that suite of species that are likely to be moved around on boots. And here in Illinois, where I'm at, there's a few species that I wanted to highlight that it seems like these are our target species for this. And the first is garlic mustard. So if you're unfamiliar with garlic mustard, it's a biennial plant. It spreads through our forest. It's a major problem in a lot of forests throughout the Midwest and the East. But it is spread through little dark, hard seeds, and they move around in mud, move around in dirt and soil. It's easily picked up on boots. So this is one of the primary species that we would be targeting with these boot brush stations. And just to show you here, there's a young garlic mustard rosette growing right beside a well-worn boot brush, just to show that it is spread around that way. The other species that we target a lot in this area is Japanese stiltgrass. So Japanese stiltgrass is an annual invasive grass that also invades our forest, creates big mats like this, and it's a problem. It spreads pretty easily. It'll spread by water and other things, but we're finding that those long distance introductions are often human mediated, whether it's boots or equipment or soil or something like that. But this one also produces a ton of seed. There's a lot out there, and these seeds are small and hard and easily spread around. So it's one that, again, another one that we're targeting. And just another shot of a boot brush with a little Japanese stiltgrass growing right in front of it. Some of the plants, as I mentioned, that are not, it's not as effective for in these boot brushes wouldn't necessarily be the right spread prevention technique, would be the kind of stick tight or burr type seeds. This is Japanese chaff flower. It's another invader we have in this region. It's spread by seed just like the others I mentioned, but as you can see, the seed on the top right there, it has these little barbs on it. So this one is primarily spread around by attaching to clothing. We see it a lot on boot laces, on pants, things like that, shirts it'll hang on to. And here's a shot here, some chaff flower seeds and some dog's hair, and then on a coat. So it spreads around kind of by different means. And I think the educational purposes of a boot brush in terms of understanding, cleaning them, and needing to clean invasive species off can be useful, but the actual boot brush itself wouldn't necessarily address this species or similar species. So that's kind of the basics. This is just in general what a boot brush is and how it can be used. What I wanted to spend a little bit of time on now is talking about how we've used these in Southern Illinois. We've had a cooperative weed management area since 2006 in Southern Illinois. If you're unfamiliar with what a CWMA is, a cooperative weed management area, they're partnerships, multi-agency, multi-organization partnerships in a given area where they work together to try to address the problem of invasive species. So with River to River, they had a bunch of partners, whether they're federal partners, state partners, and some nonprofits. But they wanted to work initially in 2006 when we started, the big push was education and awareness. At that time, invasive species weren't as well known. We thought the general public didn't understand the problem, didn't know about invasive species, or weren't as familiar with them. So we wanted to start with a lot of public education, raising awareness about these issues, and decided to use boot brushes as one of those means to kind of help us out. And so our goal initially with these boot brush stations not only was to prevent the spread of invasive plants throughout our region, but really we wanted to brand Southern Illinois as a place that cares about invasive species, that's worried about invasive species, and one that we wanted everybody to know about. And so we decided to do this really on multiple fronts to raise this awareness. Not only use boot brushes, but kind of use them as a complement to a lot of other efforts that were underway. Specifically, we had things like equipment loans and signage. We had different signs put up at refuges, different sites, and then boat ramp signs. And so the idea is if you're in Southern Illinois, if you're just driving around, if you're boating, fishing, if you're hiking, you're going to see similar messages about invasive species kind of wherever you go. And that's the idea of branding this area and kind of getting repeated messages. Whether you're on state land, federal land, or whatever, it's the repetition of seeing this message about invasive species. And boot brush stations were kind of one part of that effort. Some of the other stuff we did was start an awareness month that then spread across the entire state. And then also species-specific programs and efforts that people could come out to. As well as publications, flyers, and information out there, booklets. Again, it's multiple fronts and trying to get the message across to people about invasive species in multiple ways, so they're seeing that message again and again. And boot brushes fit into this, as well as work days, field tours, things like that, getting that information out, getting people exposed to the problem of invasive species. But boot brushes were one of the first things we did, and we wanted to get them on the ground right away because we knew that this region had a lot of hiking trails, had a lot of recreational users, both from within the area and also from elsewhere coming in. So we thought that the use of boot brush stations would be a great opportunity to target the message to people that are stakeholders, people that already enjoy nature, that want to get out and recreate, and would have, probably it's an easy sell to them in terms of they already value nature, so understanding the problem with invasive species would, they could get it probably quicker than general people. So we wanted to start that at first. Right away, we put these stations, boot brush stations, on trailheads kind of across through southern Illinois, on state and federal land, and we started out with 20 some, and then we got a grant to do more than that. But again, we spread it out again across ownerships and across the entire region. So whether you're doing it, you're recreating on state land or federal land or even nonprofit land, you have the opportunity to see these signs. This was our original sign that we created. We started with this general message. We had all our partners labeled up there, and then some of the species that we targeted. We like this. We changed it a little bit the second go around, where we try to shorten the verbiage a little bit, put some better pictures in, and add a QR code that sent you to a website. Overall, I will say though, I really like Play Clean Go's design a lot better than this one. I still think this one's a little too wordy, and what I've gathered with talking to people and being out on the trails with people, they're not going to spend a lot of time at the trailhead reading through this. They're not going to read a lot of verbiage. They're going to kind of get the general message and then move on. So I do think that our signage is a little long. I would, to do it over, the next time we do it, we're going to shorten considerably the verbiage, increase the size of the pictures to make sure that our message is really right on the forefront, easily obtainable, and then people can kind of go on and go about their business. But these are used. You'll find them throughout the region, wherever you go. Currently, in southern Illinois, through the cooperative weed management area, we have right at 50 boot brush stations at trailheads, and it's across the full 11 counties. We've partnered with a couple nonprofits that have land with hiking trails to add that to our already state and federal ones. Now, all of these don't have the same signage. Some of the agencies kind of had more requirements that they use some of their own designs, or they wanted to highlight their own agencies or put a little different information in it, and I think that's totally fine. They don't have to have the same exact wordage, but they're all giving the same message across, is that we care about invasive species, they're a problem, and you can help by cleaning your shoes and not spreading them around. So even though they're not the same exact sign, they still give the same message. So they're being used across the region. Here's a shot of my boy who's turning a teenager this year. So this is a little bit of an older shot, but using these boot brush stations. And what I find is kids love to use them. They just eat it up, right? They love cleaning their shoes and having fun with them, and it's nice to see. We even got some information out on our local television stations. This is a PBS special about invasive species, where we highlighted these boot brushes and kind of right after we installed them, so people could come out and kind of know what they're looking at and expect to find them. Now, when we installed them in this region, we bought them as a complete package, in the sense that we bought the signage, the brackets, the brushes, all of that together. And then for many of them, we did a contract installation where we hired somebody to put it together and actually install it. And that included the concrete, the gravel, the weed mat, and the wood. And so this was a kind of, by doing it this way, which is really hands-off and putting everything together and doing it, it cost us between $400 and $600 per completed installed boot brush. It's definitely doesn't have to be that expensive if you want to install them yourself. And we had a lot of people, we had a lot of ours installed either by staff, volunteers, or interns. We even had a Boy Scout install one or organize an installation day as part of his Eagle Scout project. And so you can save a lot of cost there just by putting a lot of the labor in yourself or with volunteers. And then if you have somebody in your staff that's handy with fabrication, you can make a lot of the brackets and things as well. You don't have to necessarily buy everything. So you could get by with just buying the printed signage and a minimum of things and make these a lot cheaper. But if you really want a package that's just put together and being able to put into the ground, $300 to $400 per station is what it's going to cost, and it cost us between $100 and $200 per station to have somebody install them. Now, the real question, and what I wanted to spend the rest of the time in this webinar about, is understanding, do these boot brush stations work? And I kind of started with the question is, do they help reduce the spread of invasive species? And that led to kind of four big questions that under that is, well, how many seeds are on boots? Is that actually an avenue for invasive species to spread? How many of those are removed through brushing? If there are seeds on there, are they actually from invasive species? And then are people even using these boot brushes? So that's kind of the four questions that I see that need to be answered to understand how well boot brush stations work. In terms of this last one, are they being used? Just observationally, I would say, they're absolutely being used pretty quickly after putting one in the ground. You start to see these mounds of dirt forming underneath of the boot brushes as people clean their shoes and knock the dirt off. And then you see, again, those worn bristles pretty quickly. So we know they're being used, just anecdotally. But I wanted to spend a couple minutes on this recent study from Australia. They looked at a national park, and Gill et al. Interviewed a bunch of users about cleaning their boots and cleaning their shoes. And the one thing about this research was not all the sites had boot brush stations. So they were asking people about cleaning their shoes, whether they bring their own boot brushes or they use one. So it was a little bit different that way. But what they found was that about 60% of the respondents never brushed their boots before they walked, and about 33% of them never brushed their boots off after they walked. So there's a lot of opportunity of people that are not cleaning their boots necessarily that they could be. In terms of this, their study really highlighted the importance of education, where when they asked people about this, 71% of them said they would be very likely to clean their boots before a hike if they were advised to do so. So if they were told it was important, they would be likely to do it. And then you add to that, 21% said they would be somewhat likely to do that. So overall, you've got over 90% of the people saying that, yeah, they would probably do that if they were advised to. And I think, to me, that really highlights why you need to put education out there and show people why it's important to do this. Some of the barriers they found to action, the big one, either before or after the hike, was lack of equipment. So if you remember, these are the people that didn't necessarily have boot brush stations on there. But the number one reason why they're a barrier to them cleaning their shoes is that there's not equipment right there at the trail. So again, highlights the need for these boot brush stations. Specifically, looking at boot brush stations, they asked people, why aren't you using them? And this was at areas that did have them. And the number one and number two reasons were cleanliness, condition of station, and then difficulty to use. So they found that if a boot brush station was broken at times, or the bristles were gone, that was a major challenge to using them. If they were dirty, people didn't want to use them. They weren't drawn to them, or they were actually afraid of getting more dirty by using them. And then sometimes the location wasn't easy to get to. They didn't really know how to use them, or it just wasn't easy to access it. And then another big one was there was a queue. There was a line of people using them, so they tended to go around them. So from this, I gathered that there's some ways to overcome these challenges, and the big one is regular maintenance and regular cleaning. Some people were deterred by broken, damaged, or dirty boot brushes. So keeping those in good condition will definitely let people use them more. Understanding the placement of the station so that it's easy to see, easy to get to, and easy to use is important. Adding good signage, good education on these that they can read and explain why and how to use them. And then something that I thought, if a really busy trails, maybe consider having multiple boot brushes next to each other so that multiple people can use them at the same time, just to reduce that lineup and that queue so that more people are likely to use them. These are some ways to kind of overcome the non-use of these in some cases. Now, for our study, what we wanted to look for specifically was these two middle questions. I wanted to find out, how many seeds or what seeds are being removed through brushing, and are those seeds from invasive species? And so to do this, what we decided to do was kind of have a two-part question. And so we looked at what we call the boot brush seed bank, which is that pile of dirt that forms underneath of the boot brush from all the getting knocked off of the boots. We wanted to know, are there seeds in that? What seeds are growing in there? What plants can we grow out of that? And are those plants invasive? And is it different than what we normally find in the soil in that region? Are those seeds actually coming from outside from people's boots? And then we wanted to look at, do these boot brushes, the seed bank in these boot brushes, differ from the invasive plants growing in the area in terms of, are they actually preventing or stopping seeds from different invasive species coming into the trail? And we did this a few years ago with a summer intern with some assistance from some other interns and some mentors, and we really wanted to kind of get at this. And so what we did, the first bit of our research was looking at 26 different boot brush stations, and we collected that dirt below the boot brush, and then we went about 15 meters down the trail and collected some dirt from the trail side. We cold stratified these dirt piles and then spread them out over vermiculite and then grew them in a greenhouse. And as the seeds developed out of these piles of dirt, we identified all the seedlings, counted the numbers and the species as well. And so this was a nice process. We also at the same time had our interns go out and clean the boot brush stations and replace bristles. As you can see here, collecting it, sieving out a lot of the rocks just to get the dirt, both at the boot brush and then down the trail. And then growing them out, identifying all of these little seedlings. Once they were identified and we picked out and knew what that species was, then we pulled the seedling out of there and then let others grow. So it took a while for the interns to watch this and let these plants grow up large enough to be able to correctly identify them. And there ended up being quite a few trays. We combined that with the second part of our research, where we looked at 20 kind of pre-selected invasive species that were, and then try to find those that were growing close to the boot brush station or kind of along the first stretch of the trail's edge. And then we did some ordinations to see how similar the trailhead communities, both of seeds and plants, how they differed from what we were finding at the boot brush stations. And so our species list, we wanted to primarily focus on those species that had small hard seeds that were likely to be picked up in boots. And you can see our list there. Highlighted are things like lespedezas, teasels, garlic mustard, the clovers. But then we wanted to add some of the other common invasive species that we knew were in the area as well, just to see if they're showing up. And again, we combine this with fixing these boot brushes and cleaning them as well. So overall, we found that the seed that came from that little mound of dirt underneath of the boot brush station contained 39 different species. So we were able to grow out 39 different species growing from this seed. 4 of them were our target species in terms of ones we were looking for, and then 14 of the 39 were exotic species. Most of those were yard or agricultural weeds. Some were native or weedy natives as well, but there was a lot of seeds and a lot of species out of there. In terms of kind of the most common ones, at the boot brushes, we found things like yellow foxtail, pathrush, crabgrass, pigweed, satin grass, which is a muley grass, and then along the trail, plantain, lady's thumb, more of the satin grass, crabgrass, and pathrush. So there's some similarities, but using this ordination, we found that here the shot is the little black dots are the boot brushes and the blue dots are the trails, and the idea is if they're clustered close together, they're more similar. And what we found from this was basically that the seed bank along the trails were all over the place. There was not a lot of similarities. Each trail had a lot of differences in terms of what grew in it, but the boot brushes were much more similar. They were clustered together. Their community of seeds were much more similar and then significantly different than what we found just in the seed bank. So even though there was very variable with the trails, the boot brushes were less variable. They were more similar to each other, and they differed from the seed bank. And that told us that there's something was different going on in those boot brush seed banks. And so we think that it kind of lended weight to that. They were different than the trails, so their seeds were coming from a different source, most likely from boots. And then in terms of what we found in terms of target species and plants that were growing in the area, what we found in the seed bank was very different than the invasive species that were in that area in general. The boot brushes and trails weren't really any different in terms of what was growing there. It was really what was in the seed bank was the difference. So that told us that the mound of dirt below the boot brush has a lot of seeds in it. Some may have fallen from adjacent plants, but it seemed the majority are being knocked off of shoes because it differs from the trail seed bank and from the growing plants in there. Some seeds are likely picked up along the trail, and then some probably arrived on the site with boots. And that just shows that these are probably being used both before and after hikes for cleaning. So in terms of our questions that we asked, how many of these are removed through brushing? It seems like there's a lot of seeds that are being removed from brushing. There was a lot of seeds in that pile, and then the majority of those seeds actually weren't from invasive species, but more from more yard weeds or agricultural weeds, though we did find some of our target species growing out of that pile. So just kind of wrapping up in terms of these summary for the whole presentation for the boot brush basics. These are tools, boot brushes are tools for spread prevention and for education. They're becoming pretty popular, but they target these plants with small, hard seeds. Play Clean Go has resources available out there for people, although definitely there's regular maintenance needed with these boot brushes to keep them operable and keep them being used. And then the design tip is definitely use those wooden boxes with gravel and mat to keep them, to increase their usefulness, increase their cleanliness, and increase their use. In terms of our Southern Illinois project, we put in about 50 boot brushes across multiple agencies, and that's part of a larger effort to brand Southern Illinois as a place that cares about invasive species, and the cost varied. It was around $400 to $600 for completed installed boot brushes, but if you can pick up a lot of that labor yourself, you can save a lot of those funds. And then lastly, in terms of how effective are these, from the study in Australia, education is really critical to increased use. Having the right signage, having it where it clearly understands why they're doing this is going to help people use these. There's some barriers to using these, but you can overcome them through regular maintenance, regular cleaning, choosing your locations correctly so it's easy to get to and easy to use, and then even potentially using multiple stations on busy trails so there's not a line of people using them and people will avoid them. And then we're finding that they do a good job of removing seeds from shoes and boots. We found lots of seeds with a bunch of different species kind of growing underneath of these boot brushes. The majority of these are ag and yard weeds instead of invasive species, but it's still removing seeds. So they do seem to be doing what they were intended to. So overall, I hope that more people continue to use these boot brushes. I know in Southern Illinois here, we're happy that we've got them. We view them as a big success. We do struggle with regular maintenance on them as well and finding the time and the manpower to do that. But it's something that has been an effective tool for us to use. And I think with that, that's kind of all I had prepared, and I want to spend the rest of the time answering any questions that we might have. And let me look at the list here if I can figure out questions on here. Okay, so one question we have is, can you recommend a source to purchase the metal boot brush mounting bracket featured in your presentation? We used a company out of Florida to do that, and unfortunately that company no longer makes them. So I don't have a source simply because the source we used is no longer um, out there. So I can't specifically recommend a source for you for that. But I do know there's other companies, and I think a lot of companies that make signage for, interpretive signage for trails and things anyway, would often have, would have an option to do a boot brush. So I'm sure they're out there. I just can't recommend one particularly because the one we used is no longer doing it. Let's see, I'm trying to be able to see these questions and I'm having a hard time seeing them.
Chris, would you rather me read them to you?
If you don't mind, yes.
Absolutely. And Zach, just to answer again for that question about recommending the mounting bracket. Never mind, I was going to suggest people for the actual signage. So one of our questions from Christina says, I live in Hawaii. We are dealing with fungal spores that infect our ahia forest. How effective are the boot brushes? Will the boot brushes be, in your opinion, for this application?
That's a good question. I'm thinking there might not be as effective, and the reason I'm saying that is I do know there was some research out of Florida looking at spores of some of the invasive ferns down there, and they found the spores were all on the clothing and everywhere, so they weren't restricted to just the boots. So they may be, a boot brush may be able to knock fungal spores off or things like that, but I'm guessing that's not going to be the primary location where they're found. So I'm guessing that you probably have to find some other means really to address that species or that problem.
Great, thanks, Chris. Next question from Diana. Do you have a methodology for the research you did on determining what was in the seed bank?
I do, and I'd be happy to share that. And basically, it was, as I mentioned, we pulled that soil out, we sieved out all the heavier, bigger rocks and gravel in there, cold stratified it for a couple weeks just above freezing, and then spread it out on vermiculite and grew it out in the greenhouse. So it's pretty straightforward, but I can certainly share all the details if people want.
Okay. And Chris, if you can provide some of this, we can send it out afterwards. Our next question comes from Forrest, and I believe someone else asked the same question. Can you share the full title or DOI link for that article? And I'm assuming it's the article from Australia.
We can provide that, yes.
Okay, perfect. Yep. So we'll provide that afterwards. Another question from Franny says, have there been any studies on the effectiveness on various signs?
Not that I could find. So no, we didn't specifically look at that, and I haven't seen any kind of research that looks at how different signage, different designs impact people. I know there's a lot of research in marketing on that for other aspects, but I haven't seen anything particular to invasive species.
Thank you. And I believe that when Play Clean Go first started, they did a lot of research on their visual aspect of the signs. So you had mentioned, that you would change some of the signs to the visual appeals that Play Clean Go offers. So another question is to confirm the boot brushes are good for garlic mustard and siltgrass.
I think so, yes. So the boot brushes work. Those are the kind of species that we want to target. Species that have small, hard seeds that are likely to be picked up in the mud or get caught in the tread of boots or shoes. That's the kind of species that would typically work with these boot brushes in terms of typically be knocked off and like that. So we did find both of those in our seed bank study. So it did knock a few of them off. So yes, I think that's the ones you target with this kind of application.
Perfect. Another question from James regarding maintenance. How do you dispose of the dirt pile under the boot brush?
You know, that's a really good question, because we just saw that that dirt pile is full of seeds. So it's something that you shouldn't just discard it and spread it around. You know, if you can incinerate it or something like that would probably be best. If you're unable to do that, you could put it in a compost pile that's being well managed, and the internal temperature of that compost pile could kill it. My recommendation, if you can, is incinerate it. You don't have that much. There's not a lot underneath of it, but as we've seen, it's full of seeds.
That's interesting. Another question is, are there studies available from North America? This question came in from Janice.
In terms of people's willingness to use things, you know, use spread prevention techniques, not that I know of. I didn't find any in preparation for this presentation, just the one from Australia. There may be, I just don't know it. We did do, as part of our work here in Southern Illinois, we did a user awareness study on invasive species where we asked different user groups, including hikers and things like that, about invasive species, and we found that they were aware of them, but we didn't specifically address willingness to clean or do spread prevention techniques.
Another question that we have from Jenna is, we have a lot of concerns in Wyoming about wind. Is there evidence of seeds which are collected from the boot brushes being spread by wind?
That's a good question. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but particularly in areas with dry soils and a lot of wind, it certainly could be a potential. I would think so, you know, moving that dry around. What we found with that pile of dirt underneath the boot brushes, since it's being brushed off and it's often dried mud, it's pretty fine particles, and so I would imagine it'd be very subject to being windblown.
Another question from Jennifer. Did you base your findings of effectiveness off of just this one limited study? And then also, to go with that, she says, did you do any research to see if any seeds or mud were left on the boot after using the brush?
This was the only study that we did. Yeah, so we did not do that. I would like to go further. Again, this was a very short intern-based research, so it wasn't something that we had the capacity to really go in detail with it. So yeah, we're basing that. It seems to be effective both observationally, just by seeing the amount of dirt that comes off of these shoes when they're being used and seeing the pile that's developed, as well as this small study is what we're basing it off of. I think there's always a lot of room for more study. I would love to see kind of how likely boots are to pick up seeds, how many seeds are on them, and then kind of what percentage of seeds are knocked off with regular cleaning, and even taking that further to come up with best management practices of how, you know, what bristles are best, or how many times you have to swipe your boots to get most of the seeds. I think there's a lot of avenue to kind of keep going on this research. We just didn't have the capacity to do it yet.
Absolutely. Another question from Jessica. Did you compare your data to areas where there were no boot brushes?
We did not. So we just used the seeds, or the seed bank along the trail away from the boot brush, and then right at the boot brush. We did not go to trails that didn't have boot brushes at that time. It's a good idea. I think these boot brushes, when we looked at them, they were only a year or two old. So moving kind of away from them down the trail probably did a good job of removing any influence of the fact that the boot brushes were there anyway. I think now that they've been in 10 years or so and they're in place, you know, you might be able to see some differences between trails that have an established boot brush versus trails that have never had one. At the point we did the study, they were so new, I doubt you could see that difference.
Next question from Katie Powell. She says, hi, Chris, on Ontario's invading species awareness program. Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that multiple agencies were on board. Did you have any resistance or any organizations which were hesitant to install?
No, actually they were all really on board, and the main thing was some of the agencies really wanted to use and design their own signs because they had different specifications or different requirements for, certain signage designs or certain things that need to be on their signs. So it took a little while, to get clearance to put those signs on their trails, and most of them were the federal agencies. But they were definitely excited about it. It just, we had to kind of redesign to meet their requirements.
These are some great questions, and I'm hoping that we can get to all of them. One question from Liz: is there any information on effectiveness on the mounted boot brushes versus people who use the handheld boot brushes to remove seeds and mud?
I haven't seen anything. The Australia study that I mentioned in here, they addressed that a little bit through willingness to use, and some of the trails they provided, if I'm trying to remember right, they provided some of those smaller handheld boot brushes just kind of there at the head for people to use. And they found that people were more likely to use a boot brush station than bring their own boot brush or even necessarily use these handheld ones. But in terms of effectiveness, I have not seen any study that looks at that.
Another question from Lori: do you know of research that has been done on cleaning stations for mountain bikes or ATVs? If so, can you share sources?
I have not. Nope, sorry.
A question from Mark. It says brushes at spots with high clay content typically are not as successful in removing soil. Is there brush styles that may be more effective in these locations? Do you know?
That's a fantastic question, and that's one thing we've noticed here is that a lot of our soil, depending on where you're at in southern Illinois, is very high clay, and he's absolutely right. Dried on clay or caked on clay or even wet is very hard to remove. And it seems to me that just, again, observationally, I don't have any studies looking at this, but observationally, the really, really stiff bristles, there was some bristles that we bought and put in that were so hard you had to really kick them to get your foot even in them. So they really brushed, really hard brush, and that seemed to do the best job of cleaning heavy clay or caked dirt off of boots, more so than the softer bristles, which are easier to push your foot through, but were less effective. So I think the thicker, stronger bristles, the ones that you had to really work to get your shoe in, were probably a little more effective, but they're harder to use, so that may actually reduce the number of people using them.
Interesting. Question from Matthew: what do you think of the smaller info signs in a cable brush? You have a picture of one on your Google image search. We at Wisconsin DNR are having a hard time with buy-in from land managers because we can't keep them maintained. Also, is it worth a sign without a brush?
That's a good question. I'll address the last part of that first. Is it worth a sign without a brush? I think it's good to have educational signage talking about invasive species, but asking them to clean off their shoes without having the equipment there, I think you're not going to get a lot of response from that. I think people are going to read that, but they have no means really to clean their shoes. So it depends on the purpose of your sign. I think it's great to have educational signage, great to raise awareness about invasive species, but addressing cleaning shoes without having some mechanism to clean them, I don't think is going to be that effective. In terms of the other boot brushes, you're absolutely right about maintenance. That's something that we struggled with. Is once they install them, at first we kind of give the responsibility of maintenance over to the individual sites, and we found that a lot of times they're busy. They've got a lot of other needs that sometimes these boot brushes went unmaintained, and then as soon as they're unmaintained, they become unused after a little while, or they just don't attract people to look at them, or they don't get the message across because they're in poor condition. So regular maintenance is something that is definitely is going to be a struggle. We found that interns, it's a simple project. It doesn't take a lot of knowledge level. Replacing bristles and cleaning boot brushes is something that volunteers, groups like Master Naturalist programs or interns or just regular volunteers can do pretty easily. And I would definitely recommend using those groups as much as you can to kind of overcome that maintenance hurdle. In terms of the different types of boot brushes, we've most dealt with these installed boot brush stations. That's what I have most experience with. So I'm not sure about the effectiveness of other kinds.
Thanks, Chris. We have a couple more minutes. So Maria Winkler says, is there any move to encourage people to brush their dogs at trailheads? In Seattle, Washington, we are consolidating instant handheld brushes near off-leash areas to help prevent garlic mustard spread in our parks.
You know, I think that's a great idea. I think that there's one thing that we've addressed here in Southern Illinois. We have a large community of equestrian riders that also share the trails, and we've talked with them and addressed kind of this idea of spread prevention with them, both through brushing seeds off of their horses and their equipment, as also using things like weed-free forage as well. And I know that's something that Naismith does. So we would try to address some of that with the equestrian community, but I think also, you know, dogs or other pets or even equipment like ATVs, there's a lot of avenues that also should be addressed. You know, this boot brush really addresses a narrow band of hikers, but there's a bunch of other avenues for species to spread, and that should be addressed. And again, we've touched on it here in Southern Illinois with the equestrian crews, but there's a lot of other avenues, including dogs, for sure.
Last question, and I'm sorry we're not able to get to all of them. Sean Howard asked, there's for 50 boot brushes at $500 per station would be about $25,000. Wondering if, one, you had any pushback from this cost versus using that for staff time to control and manage, and two, suggestions on funding sources for this type of infrastructure installation. Sorry.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. That's really good. Keep in mind that that's per station, but we saved a lot of cost through having a number of these. I think we installed 20 of them or so through that contract installer, and the rest were installed by staff. So that cuts the number down a little bit there. But also, this money didn't just go, or these didn't go just to one agency. This was across agency boundaries. So we had 2 different national wildlife refuges, 7 or 8 different state parks, we had the national forest, we had a couple different nonprofits. And so this was a great example of, you know, kind of the power of a cooperative weed management area or partnership where we're sharing those resources across the region and things like that. So there wasn't a lot of pushback. I definitely understand your comment about using that for staff time. But to me, that $25,000 for 50 boot brushes is a really good deal in terms of if they're maintained. I mean, that's a long-lasting educational program throughout the whole region, which is what we're wanting to do. In terms of funding sources, we used a couple different funding sources. They were mostly state kind of conservation funding. We used some internal funds as well, but I would imagine, you know, anything that's kind of environmental education potential, any of the foundations, maybe potentially whether they're forest related or, you know, fish and wildlife related foundations may have programs. Pulling together initiative, you know, this might be an educational wing for a larger grant, something like that. We did it in small chunks, right? So we had a couple $1,000 grant, we had a $10,000 grant. So we pieced it together over time, over, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 years, and it was something that, yeah, it wasn't difficult to get the money, but it just took a while to get it going.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here for this presentation. Chris, I think this is one of the best presentations that I have seen so far, and I just want to thank you. To those that still have questions up on the board, if you would like to email those, we will try and get those answered for you. And thank you all for participating, and we will see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.